So myself and Neil here, we're just going to talk you through our camera setups. We're going to show you the things that we would set to our function buttons, suggestions for the I menu, and we'll talk you through some of the features that you'll find on a Z7II.
So I've been really impressed by the Z7II today with the coastal landscapes we shot. Dynamic range was impressive, really good. Focusing was spot on.
I think one of the biggest changes that we've both seen is how simple yet effective the extra shutter speeds are. So the ability to just choose 60 seconds, 120 seconds. And previously we were relying on time and bulb modes, and you have to have, you were timing the exposure yourself, you had to then end the exposure. And we even said earlier that our lives are just so much easier now, and it might sound quite trivial, it's such a small thing, but it has made quite a difference to the way that we shoot anyway.
To enable the longer exposure settings, that's in manual mode. So we go into the custom settings menu on the camera and we enable extended shutter speeds from the menu. That now gives us access to the longer shutter speeds. I'm going to go into the photo shooting menu, put long exposure noise reduction on. So when the long exposure finishes, it will do a dark frame exposure, same length of my normal exposure.
The key thing you need to remember is not to turn your camera off, right? Because that will then break up the long exposure noise reduction. But once that's complete, you then get your final RAW file. If you do turn your camera off by mistake, you still get the original RAW file. It's just it won't have the long exposure noise reduction applied. So it's just one thing to keep in mind.
So I'm in manual mode. I've set my 480-second exposure. Before I trigger the image using the shutter button, one of the other things I'm going to use is exposure delay mode. I'm going to go into the custom settings menu, set exposure delay mode. I'm going to set a 3-second delay. So that's going to give me 3 seconds after I press the shutter, my 480-second exposure will start.
Just means you're not going to add any shock to the camera when you start in the exposure. And because we're using the built-in 480 seconds, we don't have to end the exposure. So there's no chance of us bringing any shock into the camera, and that 3-second delay is just long enough to, for you to step back from the camera and get a nice, sharp, long exposure.
So one of the other great features on the Z7II here is I can look on the top display here and I can see that I've got 120 seconds still left on my image. So we've got this countdown timer that makes it really easy to see how long's left for our long exposure.
It means that you don't have to try and use a second device as a timer, right? So it just makes that long exposure shooting just a little bit more easy.
So these new settings on the Z7II are going to make long exposure photography really easy. I'm really happy with this shot, the way this has come out. That was super simple to do a 480-second exposure.
One thing we obviously discovered today was how good the Z7II can focus through an ND filter. We have seen previous cameras, so things like D850, Z7, they were more than capable of focusing through a 10-stop filter, and we used to tell people about that all the time. But this is the first time we've seen a camera that can focus through a 15-stop. You do have to have low light AF enabled, but it was a useful feature today, especially for some of the longer exposure shots we were doing.
Okay, so it was great fun shooting under the pier there. Very dark though, so low light AF.
Obviously, I think a lot of people think about low light autofocus. They don't necessarily think about bright situations like this. But one of the things that you can do is you can still autofocus through a filter. So if you're using an ND filter like a 10-stop, or as we've just seen, a 15-stop filter, the Z7II will still autofocus through that if you need it to. You do have to have low light AF turned on, but you can still focus through a 15-stop filter. If you're manual focusing, then you're manual focusing. But if you do forget to autofocus, or if something changes whilst you've still got your filters on, it just means you can focus that shot straight away.
And one of the other things there, even with the filters on, the dynamic, it's very dark under there, and we've got this bright sunlight, dynamic range on the Z7II is just exceptional.
Even when you're working with filters and you're working with that dynamic range together, right? Because you want to be able to lift shadows or bring highlights in somewhere. So having a great RAW file that you know and can trust to be able to lift the dynamic range or bring the highlights in, it's going to be really interesting to see what the shot comes out like.
One of the other things I've got on my eye menu is focus peaking. Anything with big depth of field where you're shooting f8, f11, get the sweet spot of the lens, and that sort of shows you what is sharp in the frame as well. And what I also have on there is the split screen mode, so that enables me when I'm focusing to be able to see whether I've got a foreground sharp and a background sharp as well at the same time. So Z7II here, low and close, one of my favourite ways of shooting with a wide angle lens. A lot of people think wide angle lenses like this 14 to 24 f2.8s is great for getting everything in. I actually prefer it low and close. We've got this old tree here, sort of lightning struck, it's dead, fantastic shapes on it. I'm in, I'm close, I'm low, tilted up. We exaggerate the leading lines from the branches as they come in, and I can focus here using focus peaking on it. Switch to manual focus, the outlines in red like so. We've got the sun as it sets behind, underlighting the clouds, and we exaggerate the cloudscape as it comes through.
A lot of people often talk about how shooting with such wide angle lenses can be quite difficult. And I think it's just trying to know what you want from your composition beforehand. And we particularly, both of us, like shooting kind of really low, but close to that subject. It gives you great foreground interest if you've got a foreground interest element. And it just means you get this really nice depth to your shots as well, right?
My FM1 button here on the front, I've actually got that for the portraits I do. I've got that assigned to jump into my flash control. So when I've got the WR11 plugged into the side here, that gives me control on my SP5000 speed lights. One of the other collections of settings that I love on the Z7II is aperture lock, where you can lock the shutter speed or aperture. So I dial in my f8 or f11, whatever I'm shooting, lock it, and that stays locked, so I can't accidentally end up on the wrong shutter speed. It's a great feature.
So Neil, we've been shooting portraits. I've obviously been using the Z7II with the 50mm 1.2, and then we've also been trying the 70 to 200 2.8. So just talk to me about your thoughts with the Z7II and Portraiture.
Z7II 70 to 200 f2.8s, just incredible. We're in this woodland here. We've got sort of very dark areas. There's the highlights of the sky coming through. Incredible dynamic range. This lens is so sharp on the edges and in the centre. The autofocus as well on the Z7II, being able to have on the FN2 button here, and then the scroll wheel here, jump straight to eye autofocus, face detect. Having that on the menu now, not having to go sort of deep dive into the custom settings menu, that's just brilliant. Really easy to track and work. Have you been finding the 50mm f1.2?
Yeah, so I think the big thing about the 50mm 1.2 is it's outright picture quality even at 1.2. So you no longer do you have to kind of feel like, oh, I need to stop that lens down. And it's like a lot of the other Z series lenses, they perform so well wide open. And obviously in the location we're shooting in, there's a mixture of light. So there's bright areas where we're stood right now, and then there's some dark areas. And it means that I can drop down into those aperture numbers and still have a low ISO.
Yeah, and I've been using aperture lock here to lock this open at f2.8 and 200mm f2.8. Super, super sharp.
Yeah.
Focusing, just nailed it. Wide open, long focal length, and you just get this 3D effect, don't you? It's just incredible. So I've been using eye autofocus. We've got it on wide area large, where it just nails the eye and grabs focus. We've also got it on full auto area, where using the multi-directional pad, we can choose between the left eye or right eye. I tend to prefer having the eye closest to the camera as the one that's sharp.
So building on that, and obviously using eye autofocus for stills, we can now use that eye autofocus in video as well. It just means it's going to be a little bit more accurate, making sure that your subject's eyes are in focus whilst you're recording. We always say to people, it's about choosing the setting that works best for you, right? The settings that we talk about here, they work for us. This is how our cameras work, and that's what you need to kind of spend the time to figure out what setting is going to work for you. And it just means that your camera becomes your tool and it's designed for you.